Hello and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. And we are now going to do a program on a book that I think is singular in its treatment of an extremely important subject. And we're fortunate enough today to have both co-authors with us. And I speak of the book NextGen Marxism, written by Katharine, Gorka, and Mike Gonzalez. Now, I'll briefly introduce both of them from the flyleaf in the book. I do know Katie Gorka, who is an old friend of mine, and whom I first met, I believe it was in Budapest, where she was living with her husband, Seb, for quite a few years. After that, Katie and Seb came to the Washington, D.C. area, and she was, of all things, the first executive director of the Westminster Institute, which she put on the map with some of the extremely fine publications and books to which she herself contributed on how to deal with extremism and Islamist ideology and other such subjects. So, Katie, what a pleasure to have you here today. I should also add that you've been a senior political appointee in Republican administrations, and more specifically in the Office of Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, focusing on strategies preventing terrorism and targeted violence. Katie was president of Threat Knowledge Group from 2014 to 2017, providing expertise and training on irregular warfare and terrorism to the FBI, U.S. Army, Special Forces, Marine Corps, and law enforcement. From 2009 to 2014 was her stint at the Westminster Institute. Katie co-edited the volume, Fighting the Ideological War, Winning Strategies from Communism to Islamism. The co-author is Mike Gonzalez, who has resided at the Heritage Foundation for a number of years, where he is the Angeles Te Arredondo e Pluribus Unum Senior Fellow. Mike, can that all fit on one card? It
does.
He writes on a variety of subjects, including critical theory, critical race theory, identity politics, and in fact, he published a book on the subject of the damage identity politics is doing in the United States and elsewhere some 4 years ago, also published by Encounter Books. Mike is an experienced journalist, spent the better part of 2 decades as a journalist. 11 of those years were with the Wall Street Journal, in which he covered foreign countries by going to them and living in them. Clocking in 11 years, as I mentioned, the Wall Street Journal. He joined the administration of President George W. Bush and worked in the State Department's European Bureau. In his first foreign assignment, Mike was arrested and expelled from Panama by the dictator Manuel Antonio Noriega. The following year, in 1989, he traveled with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Today, he devotes nearly all his passion to defending the U.S. and the West in general from systemic overhaul and cultural genocide. This is their book, NextGen Marxism. Welcome to the program. What instigated this book?
Katie and I met at Heritage. Well, actually, we met 8 years ago when we were both advisors to Ted Cruz in his campaign. And then we worked together at Heritage. I thought she possessed a very good mind, an analytical mind. I thought it would be great to write papers with her. We wrote 2 papers, pretty solid papers. And then we decided, well, one of them can really be expanded. We had a lot more material, and it happened to be, we thought, the threat to American life, to our way of life. And we said, we really need to write this into a book. We talked to Encounter. We talked to Roger, and he agreed. And we worked on this for the better part of 2 years, talking to each other every day. But it was really the sense, in my opinion, maybe Katie disagrees, it was the sense of this is really a big threat. We're living through a very consequential time. We are facing with cultural genocide unless we do something about it and reverse it. And we went at it and put it all down in a book.
So, Katie, what is NextGen Marxism? It only takes you 300 pages.
In 3 sentences or less. Well, look, the big difference is I think it's important that we called it Marxism, first of all. Now, there are people who will contest that and say, but no, because it's not all about the economics anymore. But I think the reason it's important to first of all call it Marxism is because Marx presented us with a worldview in which the world is divided into two halves that are in direct opposition to each other and that cannot make peace with each other. Now, in his day, he said it was going to be, the conflict was between the owners and the workers in the factories. You know, today it's very different. It's gone through several evolutions. Very importantly, one of the big changes was the shift to, quote, cultural Marxism, where the argument was, we're not going to bring about Marxism through violent revolution. We're going to bring about Marxism by infiltrating the cultural institutions and gradually changing the sort of intellectual thinking, the milieu, right? Next-gen Marxism is yet one more step in that progression. So it's like cultural Marxism, but now where cultural Marxism, I feel the locus of revolution was really students and intellectuals. Today, it's based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ideas about gender. But I would say many of the other sort of same ideas still hold true. They absolutely believe that we will not make peace with each other. It's not like, you know, in the classic American sense that we can work together to solve our problems. You know, that is the American idea. No, they say we are in fundamental conflict with each other, and the only way this will end is when one side prevails over the other.
You remember a quote from Lenin in which he said, "The point of an argument is not to convince someone, but to destroy them."
Oh, perfect.
That is actually, that's a great point, because that's the difference between Hegelian dialectics and the Socratic dialogue. The Socratic dialogue is supposed to end in a unison, a synthesis of the thesis and the antithesis. Dialectic, one side is going to destroy the other. And this idea, I was reading to a visiting fellow from Spain at Heritage 2 weeks ago, the passage in the manifesto where Marx is saying, you know, this is what Katie just said, all of history can be boiled down to this epic struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat and all that. And this fellow said to me, that is the opposite of what Paul said in letter to the Galatians. There's no longer slave and owner. There's no longer Jew nor Gentile. We're united in belief in Christ, something that Lincoln then echoes in his famous speech in Chicago in 1848, where he's addressing, he says, so many of us are immigrants now. Very few of you will have ancestors in the revolutionary generation, but believing in the documents, believing in all men are created equal, makes you the same seed. Paul says the same seed as Abraham. Lincoln says the same seed as the founders. Marx is the denigration and denial and opposition to all that.
To, first of all, Christianity, which is the number one enemy.
Right, exactly.
And to, as you just mentioned, Mike, the founding principle of the United States, that all men are created equal.
Right.
I have to tell you what impressed me so deeply about this book is the detailed genesis you give of these thoughts. And you take the thoughts of today and show their provenance going back to the 1920s or earlier. Then you see, first of all, how they were first formulated, what was the ideological stance, which, as you point out, is highly reductive. You have to truncate part of reality to fit everything into their ideological schema. And then you give the line of transmission of how whom did they train, how did they get to the next generation, did they at all modify or adjust to historical circumstances, the original ideology, and then going again to the next generation? And there is a transformation of this going on, as you've just pointed out, Katie, some of those adjustments. And in fact, after beginning with Marx and giving a very neat summation of what that ideology teaches, you spend a lot more time on the person who is a far more influential figure in today's thinking, which is Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist. Do you want to talk a bit about the distinction between those two, or how one developed from the other?
Look, Katie and I set out to write the definitive book. We wanted to, and we paid a price. By the book is heavier, it's longer than we would have wanted it to be, but we wanted it to be as definitive as possible.
But this is why it's invaluable.
Yes.
You've got the whole, not just the story, the record. You have everything is in here.
By the way, I want to say that to hear that from you is very humbling to me, and I'm sure to Katie.
Oh, say it again.
Because you're such a revered figure. You're such a historian, so I'm very pleased. And I'm going to ask Katie, after I'm going to take a minute here, I want her to talk about Lenin, because Katie is very big on Lenin. I'm glad that she convinced me to add so much on Lenin. But on Marx to Gramsci, Marx fails. Marxist ideas fail. Onto Lenin, I'll let Katie talk about that.
In what way? Failed in what?
Well, the first 70 years, there's no revolution. In fact, the people who chart the discussion of Marxist ideas in the popular press or in literature, they hardly get a mention until 1917, when it fails against Marx's ideas, because Marx said this has to come in an industrialized place. It comes in a backward part of Europe that's only very partly industrialized, the Tsarist empire. And then when it fails miserably in Germany and Italy, basically because the Italian and German worker refused to take part in the revolution, they're very proud, the Germans especially, of what they have done in the factory floor. When that happens, and Gramsci is the one that says these workers have imbibed the ideas of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie, we need to deprogram them. We need to make sure that we need to clean out their brain and put in new ideas, get rid of the hegemonic narrative and put in a revolutionary narrative. But I left a hole there for Lenin, so I want Katie to fill it up.
But just since you mentioned that hegemony is a big word with him.
It's a huge word. He did not invent the word, but it's one that he uses, and it's in Italian. I read some Italian, so it's not. It's hegemonia culturale. It's cultural hegemony. It's I haven't found any instance of the hegemonic narrative in Italian. Maybe that's because Pete Buttigieg's father, who was the one who translated Gramsci, did not include it, but or mistranslated it. But anyway, I left you some. I think you should fill in with Lenin.
Yeah, so I think that the important point about Marxism failing is that Marx predicted that the worker would revolt and overthrow the system. What he failed to predict is that capitalism itself would resolve many of the issues for the workers, right? They actually wanted their jobs. They didn't want to overthrow their culture, their families, their places of work. They just wanted better conditions. Capitalism delivered the better conditions to them. So, to me, one of the most interesting things in looking at the history and trying to understand how we got to where we are today is seeing, I think one of the reasons that they got as far as they did to where we are now is that in every generation you've had those who just dedicated themselves to understanding why their revolution failed and then trying to do it a little bit better. So, the first one was really Lenin, who I think 1906 wrote his essay, What is to be Done? Because he couldn't understand why the Marxist revolution wasn't happening. Lenin came up with this sort of magic formula, which is really important because it's kind of the formula that is still being used today. And Lenin's formula was this. He said, if you can use information and propaganda to such a degree that you can make a certain group of people feel victimized, feel aggrieved, and then you organize them, you can bring about a revolution. That was his theory. And what's so interesting is Saul Alinsky then took that and kind of translated it into the American idiom.
Just tell us who Saul Alinsky was.
Saul Alinsky was a big community organizer in Chicago in the 1930s, 40s, 50s.
Well, he really, I think he's probably late 40s.
40s.
And then he dies, I think, in the early 90s.
He lived for a long time because what's interesting is he shaped not only the generation of the 60s, but the subsequent one of the 70s and 80s.
Definitely 50s and 60s. That's when he's hitting his stride.
Yes, exactly. So he himself was never, probably not a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, but he worked right alongside them. They were very active in Chicago.
He said he did.
He said he did. And he learned from them. The Communist Party, for example, here in the United States, had a very, very elaborate organizational structure. Organizational and informational structure. They were really good at setting up this very complex network, and that's how they were able to make some progress, right? Saul Alinsky used that to organize community neighborhoods to get power and change their circumstances. What I find really interesting about Alinsky is that he then had kind of a revival in the late 60s, because at that point you had the student revolution, the student revolutionaries realize that yet one more time the revolution has failed, right? You get to the end of the 1960s, the students who were supposed to be the great hope of the revolution, they didn't bring about the revolution they wanted, which was the end of the United States, basically, as we know it. So they all kind of went a few different directions, but one group went into the direction of organizing. They said the reason our revolution failed was because we didn't organize well enough. We are going to train people. We are going to organize. And they created something called the Midwest Training Academy. Saul Alinsky worked with the Democratic Socialists of America, came up with a training program. Guess who comes out of that training program is Obama. Here they are, 50 years later, they are still training radical leftists.
And this organizing is a key feature of NextGen Marxism. It is American-style organizing, along with the basing the revolutionary zeal in the racial and sexual minorities, the marginalized categories. That's an added feature of NextGen Marxism.
But it's interesting that you point out that Alinsky's neighborhood organizing activities wouldn't start by beating the drum for Marx or Lenin, but are you having trash collection problems in your neighborhood?
Exactly.
Is the water pure enough for your children to drink?
Eric Mann, we quote him at length. Eric Mann is another organizer. He former weatherman. And he talks about this a lot, that when you go into an apartment in a project and you're trying to organize the people there, you talk about the heating, you talk about the windows, you talk about the landlord. Only after the third visit will you mention Castro. If something's on TV, will you drop something? But at the beginning, it's about their interests before you raise their consciousness.
So there's an element of deception here.
Oh, it's complete deception.
Yeah, it's complete.
You
hook them and then you transfer.
No. This is they have pushed out revolution. They want to change society by stealth, and it's this deceit itself.
Yeah.
And they're very explicit about that, actually. I mean, they don't make a secret of it that they felt that tactically it would be important to keep their true aims quiet.
It's what's extraordinary in this book is how frank these people have been about what their objectives are and how they're going to achieve it. And you have them in quotes admitting this is what we're doing.
We try to cite the left more than we cite the right.
Oh, yeah.
We go out of our way. They're very clear about the destruction they want to achieve. but they're not clear about what they want to put in its place.
Right, yeah.
They're very coy about that. They don't say, "Hey, we want gulags and we want central planning, we want collectivism." They don't say that. They have phrases. There's one key phrase that everybody, when you hear this phrase now, you know it's commies. Is another world is possible.
Yeah.
We don't need to have capitalism. Another world is possible. We don't need to have participatory, parliamentary democracy. Another world is possible. What world, pray tell?
Yeah.
Well,
Or don't they say we want to think about what is, unburdened by what has been?
I mean, that's the more truncated way of saying it.
Yeah.
By the way, you mentioned the communist attempt to infiltrate Hollywood.
Oh, yes.
And many years ago, when I was living in California, I had the opportunity to spend half a day with Maury Riskind and Roy Brewer. Maury Riskind, of course, was the famous script writer, film writer who did the Marx Brothers movies. And Roy Brewer was a union official from New York who had been sent to Hollywood to adjudicate what he was convinced was just a jurisdictional dispute between two of the Hollywood unions, whichever two they were. And Maury Riskind said, no, that's not what's happening here. This is an attempted communist takeover. And Brewer was very skeptical. He said, well, let me tell you what's going to happen to you as you proceed. Go along the lines you do. You'll find garbage dumped in your lawn. They'll do this to your mailbox. And he mapped out what would happen, and in fact then what did happen. Wow. And then Brewer and Riskind together were the first two in Hollywood who began sounding the tocsin, and then other people came to the rescue to form a front, to use communist terminology, against the communist takeover, and they were fairly successful in preventing it.
Yeah, Reagan played a key role.
And President Reagan played a key role.
When he was head of
he was head of the union, and Charlton Heston played a good role. In fact, Alan Riskind, Maury Riskind's son, has written a book about this.
Oh, I would love to read it, because I actually think what happened in Hollywood is so important, because you look at where Hollywood is today. First of all, I think what they put out is atrocious. None of us wants to go to the movies anymore. I think half of America doesn't want to watch TV anymore because it's, they're beating us over the head with their propaganda. But even though, we can say the communists didn't manage to take over Hollywood, but in fact they kind of won.
The wokeness won, but
yes.
That's something you show how they did that a little later on in the book.
Right.
So you're jumping ahead in the story here.
We had a few heroes that I would have to say that J. Edgar Hoover was one of these heroes that prevented a communist takeover. Nixon, the member of the House, not the president, he was then I would say even McCarthy. McCarthy, Katie and I discuss openly the problems with McCarthy's methods, but there were communist infiltrators at the State Department in Hollywood when he said there were. I mean, that's just a fact. The thing is, he couldn't back up. He made a lot of claims that he couldn't back up. We used that as a cautionary tale when we were writing this. Let's not do anything that we cannot back up.
So infiltration of the entertainment system is very important, but what you show is perhaps the most important, and what the thing on which they spent most of their organizational skills was education.
Yeah, they haven't really succeeded there.
Let's talk about how they got away with that.
Well, there's an interesting argument made. I didn't make much of it here, but I'm thinking of it now. There's a professor from University of California at Santa Clara who has written a couple books about this, and he's older, so he had a longer perspective. His argument was one of the things that happened is because of the GI Bill and the Vietnam War going on in the 60s, you had this great influx of college students. And so many universities had to quickly expand, and who is there on hand to bring onto your faculty but these radical students. So you saw a really marked shift there. But the other, another really important development in that time is, as we were talking earlier, so you had the student movement of the 1960s. They were, absolutely Marxist. They wanted radical revolution. They wanted to radically change the United States. They were closely aligned with, Cuba and
They went to Cuba.
They went to Cuba. And you get to the end of the 60s and there's a great disappointment because they feel their revolution has failed. So they kind of break off into three different groups. So you have one group that says, our problem is that we weren't radical enough. And those are the ones that form the Weather Underground and go full bore terrorism. One group we've discussed who really put their efforts into organizing. But a third group said, no, we have to tackle this through the universities. And in particular, there was an approach going through the law schools where they said, we have to fundamentally change this country by changing the laws. And so that led to the creation of what's called critical legal studies, which is
The predecessor to critical theory.
Marxism applied to the law, or law to bring about Marxism. They managed to go along for about 20 years, training up a new generation of law students in this Marxist legal discipline.
But they don't call it that.
No, they do. They call it critical legal studies.
Duncan Kennedy in interviews admits freely, he's the leading expert the leading godfather of critical legal studies. He freely admits in interviews that he bases himself on Marxism, on critical theory, on postmodernism. He says he's very impressed by that.
They're very open that critical legal studies, the whole goal of it was to fundamentally change the United States along Marxist lines. But what happens is after 20 years, that generation that they've educated has their own revolution. They say, so this very now more diverse group of young legal scholars says, okay, to you white men, your time is done. You need to get out of the world of civil rights and this legal approach. We are taking over now. And this was the famous conference that took place in the summer of 1989 that led to the creation of critical race theory.
In a convent. In a convent of all places. But critical legal studies, what they wanted to do was demolish the idea of law from within. And they said, well, the law exists to keep the powerful in power and the rich in wealth. And they, as Katie said, members of the critical legal studies conferences who were black or Japanese American, in one case Mexican American, in the case of Richard Delgado, they said, okay, so it's the powerful and the rich, but you haven't noticed they're all white. All the powerful and all the rich are white, and you don't want to deal with that because you yourselves are white. So as Katie said, there was a putsch from within. They overthrew, and very few of the critical legal studies people survived. One that did was Duncan Kennedy himself, who the critical race theory people allowed in, even though he's a very white man. I think he's still alive, actually. So yes, this is evolution, but it's all based on critical theory, which, as we say in our book, and you said yourself that we trace everything back to the 1920s, it's a German idea that about how to, and it's all these. They are the Institute for Social Studies at the University of Frankfurt. It's known colloquially as the Frankfurt School, and they're all Marxist. In fact, many of these members were members of the Communist Party, had taken part in some of the communes during the German Revolution in the 1920s and the early 20s, and they were all. We come close to saying it in our book, but it looks to us like they were working together, working closely with Moscow, and then Lenin dies, and that whole push kind of dies with Lenin, or is overthrown by Stalin. So they no longer have. Then they move away a little bit from Stalin, but at the beginning, this is all very tight. Let's not forget we're talking about Gramsci. once the Italian Revolution fails, he goes to Moscow. He spends about a year and a half in Moscow. He meets Lenin. He meets Trotsky. He also meets Stalin. But the ties with Lenin with very strong. I would say we're probably never going to find out that Lenin and Moscow order the creation of the Frankfurt School.
Interesting.
Because they're so closely aligned with the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow. But as I said, Lenin dies in 1924, and then everything changes in Moscow. Everything changes in the Soviet Union.
And then you point out the migration, thanks to the Nazi Party,
Right.
of the members of the Frankfurter School to the United States.
Many of them were Jewish, not in religion. Marcuse, Horkheimer. Karl Korsch was not. Karl Korsch, who was a very important member of the Frankfurt School, was not himself Jewish. But many of them were secular Jews who wanted to escape. They escaped to Geneva first, and then Teachers College at Columbia University offered them, this is Dewey's perch, offered them a office space, and they moved.
Was Dewey responsible for this?
I don't know. Have you found any evidence of that?
I don't know.
When did Dewey die, actually? I don't know when Dewey died. But I think Dewey himself is a founder of Teachers College, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think he is. It could be easily Googleable.
But Dewey, I mean, the reason why I asked that question is, as you know, Dewey did a tremendous amount of damage in American education.
And also influenced by German ideas. Just earlier German.
Bingo.
Yeah.
That he was an historicist, that
Yes.
there were no enduring transcendent moral principles, that everything was a product of history.
German ideas.
The triumph of history over nature. That's the story of all these people. Yeah, so it makes sense.
Well, they don't believe in absolute truth, so they're all historicists.
Yep, that's another way of saying it. We mentioned that Gramsci loves the word hegemony, but you also use the word several times in this book of legitimacy, and that the whole point of the attacks on the establishment is to undermine the establishment's legitimacy and transfer the legitimacy to their group.
Right.
So they're the ones now who will have hegemony.
Yeah.
So legitimacy is the name of the game, really. Can you keep it or can you lose it? And then, of course, they describe every aspect of society as existing to reinforce that legitimacy.
Right.
Whether it's religion or the press or education or the arts. It's all this reductionist view. Everything can be distilled down to power.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to put the focus more on the word power, because I think that's what it really comes down to. And again, yeah.
Well, legitimacy.
Yes.
Legitimacy undergirds power.
Yeah.
I mean, in classical China, when they thought a dynasty was over, they lost the mandate of heaven. You know, if you don't have legitimacy anymore, why are you in power? Why do you rule? So it's the same thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think an equally important thing you do early in the book, and you remind the reader of this throughout, that along with this historicism, moral relativism, is that fundamental idea that nature doesn't exist, that there is no permanence to nature. Nature is a product of history too. It's not nature versus history. It's not that we have a permanent nature that points us to those moral virtues that lead to our thriving as human beings, becoming more of a human being by exercising or obtaining these virtues. That's gone. There's nothing permanent about our nature. We're the products of history too. And if you change the circumstances in which man lives, you change man.
They believe in changing human nature. And to go back to that, they believe that man can apprehend the world through his five senses, but he cannot comprehend it without a cognitive superstructure, without a conceptual superstructure.
Which you enforce on.
Which you enforce. I mean, you can change. So a tree is not a tree. You know, a tree is a tree only because of the conceptual superstructure. You have the postmodernist craze that you can deconstruct anything.
But you know what's shocking to me? In a way, they've been successful.
Yeah.
I mean, look what they've been able to, the way that they've been able to rewrite reality.
Well, the corruption of language today is a notable success in that respect.
Things that do not pass 4 years ago did not pass the laughing test. The eyeball will tell you you're saying an untruth, and this goes back to Gramsci's praise for Marx as the best thing Marx did, and we also quoted Gramsci in the book saying this, is that Marx said that nature was malleable, that nature could be changed.
That's the whole point. Yeah, and if you could change the language, that's one more instrument through which to change reality. And get people to refer to reality in a way other than what it is. That has progressed to an extent that is really, really shocking. And why were we so susceptible to this?
This is what Sebastian and I spend a lot of time talking about. His theory is, he says, well, we've come to hate ourselves, and that doesn't fly for me. I mean, I think you can ask more like, is it because we've lost our faith? If you lose your faith, right, then there's no reason to cultivate virtue. There's no reason to actually look at another human being and say they have equal worth to me, because we are both created in the image of God. And if you have no faith, you're reduced to material, to just material aspirations. So I don't know. This is the only thing that makes any sense to me. But what I found really interesting was that long view, the changes that took place over centuries of where we, took God off the pedestal that he'd been on and started thinking more and more, we belong on that pedestal. We can change everything. We can shape human nature. But I think one of the things that really shocked me, and I think this is the kind of the foundation for a lot of the problems we face today, was the idea of Rousseau in France, that first of all, his fantasy, that this image really struck me, that fantasy that we can get rid of government, we're going to decide things by bringing a group of peasants to sit around under a tree and come to agreement on anything, was just so absurd. But more frightening was the other idea, the other side of this, which is, what do you do in a society with the people who disagree with you? And so I think the brilliance of the United States is that we have said, we can find a way to live together but disagree. And that's, the seed of that was in the Mayflower Compact. It was codified in the Constitution. That's really, I think, what makes the United States so unique. Rousseau said the very opposite. He said, well, the people who don't agree with you, you do away with.
In that idea, it's very much still with us, and I think I would argue it's at the heart of organizing. And this idea that you can have participatory democracy, which is superior to parliamentary democracy. Because the way we in the United States and the West in general litigate and adjudicate our differences is through the political process. Mm-hmm. But they don't want it that way. They think that they can have councils. The German and Italian revolutions were all about councils. The Soviet Union was all about councils. Soviet is the Russian word for council. And this idea that the neighborhood organizing, the neighborhood can decide these things, mm-hmm. and then grow in larger. That is, I think, I had never thought of it this way till now, Katie. It's probably Rousseauian, don't you think?
I don't know. That's interesting.
If I could mention the other really significant thing about Rousseau is that man in the state of nature was pre-rational. He was just another animal in the forest. And there was no such thing as the family. these pre-rational human beings would sort of couple accidentally in the forest, and 2 weeks later, one partner wouldn't recognize the other.
Well, you talk a lot about this.
Well, given the way he treated his own family, that's probably his fantasy.
Oh, thank you for saying that, because it's the one thing we have left out here. And I think it's so important that you made a point of this in your book, that what many of these ideologies are is a rationalization of moral misbehavior.
Thank you. Yes, 100%.
That's what's going on here.
Yeah. Isn't it incredible? Yes. I was so struck by that. So it was in researching the chapter on
gender.
Well, sexuality.
Yeah,
sexuality. You know, why is it that, first of all, we've ended up in a place where it's our children who are on the front line of this culture war, but that it's our children's sexuality that is the locus, the focus for everything, right? It is just stunning to me how they are trying to sexualize our children.
Everything.
And if you look at the genealogy of that, it just blew me away to see how every single utopian thinker, and Marx is one of them, he is a utopian thinker, every single one of them was himself or herself a sexual deviant. Not a single one lived within the confines of the traditional family. They all wanted sexual freedom.
There's not a single happy family man.
No, or woman, because there were a few women.
There's no Robert Young.
Yeah. Marx himself said he wanted to do away with the family, and he simply wanted a company of women, a community of women that would be available to men.
And his personal life was awful.
Yeah.
You know, he was a scoundrel. You know, he cheated on his wife. Both of his daughters committed suicide. One was closer to a murder than a suicide because the husband faked taking the poison, and when his wife died, he just got up and walked away. And they're at war with the family, the idea of the family. They want, very much, all of them, want to emphasize that the family is actually a late creation in the history of mankind, that it comes as a way to justify wealth accumulation, that it was not needed. The family is not needed. The family is such as we know it. And that is something that is shared by Rousseau, by Marx, by George Lukács, by Marcuse, by BLM, Black Lives Matter, who's one of their main 13 points was getting rid of the Western-oriented nuclear family. They got rid of that, by the way, when we exposed them. But that they're at war with the idea of the family. And why is that? The family, this institution that is pre-political, pre-state, is a stabilizing force. It's very hard to dismantle society if the family is intact. It gets in the way of that. So they to their destructive ends, they must get rid of the family first.
Katie, you said something earlier which I think is really key to the whole thing, and that is the loss of faith. And that these ideologies can only be really understood, as Eric Voegelin and Strauss and other great 20th century philosophers pointed out, as substitute religions. Mm-hmm. And you can only understand the elements of each of these ideologies when you see which component of the ideology fulfills this function. They will have a pseudo-fall, pseudo-Adam's fall. In other words, there's a pseudo-original sin. For Rousseau, it's when one person bumped into another in the forest and this terrible thing called society existed. It's a result of an accident. That's the original sin for Rousseau. For Marx, it's property, or each of them, for Hitler and the Nazis, it's Jews polluting the blood of the Aryans. And as they come up with these original sins, they then have to construct a substitute program of salvation. So for Hitler, it's, of course, enslave the Slavs and kill all the Jews and the Gypsies. And for Marx, etc., you've talked about that. And they also have to have a pseudo paradise. And, you know, and describe it's the classless society. They all have these components, and that's why Eric Voegelin, in his great works in the 20th century, would point out that this can only be understood as an attempt to replace the transcendent with the immanent, in which you have already said what we thought God would do, which was his saving grace and a final judgment in which you would have this transcendent share in divine life as offered by God, is that we don't need God, we'll divinize ourselves. In fact, the effort to divinize ourselves is based on our understanding that there is no God, because if there were, then we'd have to let him do it.
Right.
And that would be a surrender of power, which we're not willing to give. As the German predecessor of Marx, who said that when man gets rid of God, all of those energies which he emplaced in this false idea of God will return to man. And that's at the basis of all of these ideologies as well. And I think the thing that's so valuable about your book is that it exposes these in a fundamental way that shows what they're really up to and what is really at stake here. It's not just being kind and compassionate to a confused person. It's something much bigger is at stake.
Yeah, it's the opposite of that, actually. Our Christianity and all the world's great religions are based on forgiveness, are based on redemption, are based on a bunch of ideas that they're really opposed to. They don't want to have forgiveness. Every grievance must be curated, must be kept, must be kept alive. This is what Obama, I remember, speaking to the I think it was a Hispanic caucus about something that had happened to Ed Roybal with an LA policeman in 1952. And I was like, well, why is Obama talking about in the 21st century, in the 2010s, about something that happened to Ed Roybal 70 years ago? And it's this everything must be, all the grievances must be put in museums and never forgiven, never forgotten, kept alive. Imagine if we lived our lives that way. What hell we would create for ourselves, and that is exactly what they want.
It's interesting that where the grievances don't exist, they feel they must instill them.
Oh, well, that's Lenin, and that's 100%.
Yeah, but I mean, it's when you describe this being done, I kept imagining a kind of a Monty Python skits of these organizers or heirs, going into a family or a workshop and saying, "Do you know how bad things are?
Yeah.
No, everything's going fairly well. Yeah. What about that food? It looks terrible. No, we love this stuff. No, you don't. You don't have filet mignon. You're exploited."
This is, I gotta say this, once they create the Hispanic category in the 1970s, and in fact, there's a law in the books that explains, I think the only law that we have on our books explaining what a racial or ethnic category is, written by Ed Roybal. And Ed Roybal, by the way, just to tie a nice knot, was elected with the help of Saul Alinsky to his first seat in Congress in 1952. So once they create this category, then they have to fill it up with grievances. And I think in our book we quote Maria Teresa Kumar, the head of Voto Latino, which is one of these grifter groups on the left, and she says she's in a Zoom with Alicia Garza and with Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times of the 1619 Project, and she says, "You have no idea how hard my job is, because I have to take immigrants from Latin America, and they're so happy about this country, they're so full of hope, and I have to explain to them the systems of oppression that they live under. It's exactly the Monty Python skit that you have just described. And she's explaining it. She must rue the day that she said this, because I quote her constantly, because it's just so out in the open. Because my job is really hard.
To convince people that they're actually unhappy.
Yeah, that they're victims, that they should have all these grievances. This is really evil work.
I was trying to think of where is this. I know I've got the page dog-eared here, in which Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about her 1619 project.
I think we quote her a couple times.
Yes.
I think she's in for a couple quotes.
Here we go. You say her 1619 project is a self-conscious effort to make Americans see that they too are slaves. Quote, I like to say that the 1619 project is the red pill in the matrix.
Right.
You read this book and suddenly you start to question your reality and you realize all of this was created. And then you try to subvert it.
This is it.
I want you all to do that, unquote.
Yeah.
So there's the program. And in fact, this was said in Fairfax, Virginia, February 19th, 2023.
Was that
I could have been there. I wish I'd known.
This is incredible. So I didn't realize that's where that quote came from, because this was the talk. She made $35,000 for that 45-minute talk in the McLean Community Center, and that was actually part of why I ran to get on the board of the McLean Community Center, so that we wouldn't do that again. That's outrageous.
This is what convinced you?
Yeah.
And today you're now the chairman of the Republican Party in Fairfax.
Yes.
So that is actually, this is why we quote them, because it's so quotable. You know, we can say all we want, Katie and I. Here they are saying this. This is when we want to change reality, so you want to destroy it.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time right now, and I would like to thank our guest today, Mike Gonzalez, from the Heritage Foundation, and his co-author, Katie Gorka, for joining us today to discuss their superb new book, NextGen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It. Thank you for joining me today for this discussion. I want to encourage our audience to go to the Westminster Institute website or to our YouTube channel to see the other videos that we have available that are covering a number of topics such as China and Taiwan, Japan and China, U.S. foreign policy matters in respect to Russia and Ukraine, and even what the real causes of inflation are. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.